Hey and welcome to Neverwinter with Aragon. So I'd like to give the recommended requirements for actually completing the new trial, the Crown of Keldegonn. We're currently queued up in it. Yeah, I did a bit of parkour, quite funny, and we're up here on the battlements. So let's go over my recommended requirements for this trial in order for your team to be able to complete it. So I'm just going to go through this document with you guys, and initially you have DPS characters, and I would highly recommend you have above 70k item level, above 85% power, 50% accuracy, 85% combat advantage, 70% critical strike, and above 80% critical severity. And ideally you would be using the Batiri and the Minsk companion as your equip powers. This would be your Minsk, the bigger they are, giving you 8.6% extra damage against the boss, and then the Batiri giving you 11% damage against the boss. Along with that, you need to have a decent amount of damage per second, meaning you can get like a minimum of 450k encounter DPS on the Chilton boss dummy, so you don't even have to step in the trial to test out what your damage is like. Here is an example of my log using the advanced combat tracker. I've made a recent guide, an updated version of how to use this advanced combat tracker, and you can see on a dummy we can deal over 670,000 encounter DPS. So that's pretty top tier there and pretty good damage on a dummy, and all I'm recommending is that you get above 450k encounter DPS, and if everybody in your team can meet that requirement, you shouldn't have too much of a problem, and you should be able to theoretically hit that with these kind of statistics. However, you might need to push them a bit higher to be able to reach that, along with having certain rotations, and it will also depend on which class you're running with. And of course, lastly, make sure you do not have any intentional or consistent ignoring of mechanics. And this can happen very easy as a DPS, since you just want to get as much damage output as possible so that, let's say, you're not letting down the team, but you will be letting down the team a significant amount if you ignore a mechanic like not moving the red area to a far enough location to the edge, or not moving the bomb in time and killing your entire group. So we move on to healers. What do I recommend? I recommend to have above 65,000 item level, and the recommended stats would to have at least 80% power, 70% crit strike, 70% critical severity, and 70% outgoing healing. And of course you can use certain gear types to get this buffed up even further. In my current build, I can have that nice and maxed out. I will go over this build in another video when I finished fully optimizing it. And of course you ideally want to have a debuff or buff mount, such as the Eclipse Lion, the T-Rex, the Pegasus, or the Swarm. And that's your mount combat power here in the current tab. This would be the Pegasus with the Magnificent Inspiration. Here's the Eclipse Lion with the Eclipsed Armament, and the King of Spines with the Mythic Tyrannosaurus Rexum. You can get other T-Rexes as well, and I've tested, they do not stack. And finally, ideally you would have some previous experience just healing multiple tanks. You might have to switch your tab back and forth. You might have to coordinate with the other healer to make sure that the other tank is getting attention and is actually getting healed. A good way to do it is I heal this tank and you heal that tank, and that's your job then, and you give them their tab power, and then you can heal them with a nice big fat shield if you're a paladin, or a nice just big backup heal if you're that cleric. And then we move to tanks. Here you want to have about 60,000 item level with these required statistics. Now as a tank you have a lot of leeway. Your stats do not have to look amazing at all. We can buff up and our stats are looking pretty decent there, and this is kind of a recommendation of about 80% defense, 70% awareness, 60% critical avoidance, 50% deflect, and 50% deflect severity. Of course you can go tit for tat, get more critical avoidance and reduce your deflects. However, you could reduce your critical avoidance and get more deflects just as well. Along with that, you need to be able to have the ability to consistently hold the aggro. So by all means, whatever gear you need to use, whatever powers you need to use, make sure you're using the right ones that you can continually hold the boss's attention so he's hitting you and not your allies. Along with that, you ideally need to have some experience with tank switching. You will most likely be tanking with another tank, so you need to rotate between each other at the right times. Again, I've made guides for tanks specifically in the new trial when you should switch, and thus you don't end up dying by taking too much damage. And of course, like healers, you also want to have a debuff and buff mount combat power, like again one of the 4 following mounts. Keep in mind, you don't want to be using the same combat power as somebody else. So if somebody already is using the swarm, try and have one of the others available. And lastly, everybody should bring at least 3 mythic debuff or buff artifacts. Those are things like Thirst, Wyvern Venom Knives, Heart of the Black Dragon, Frozen Storyteller Journal. And there's much more, and I shall go over in another video where I test out every single buff and debuff artifact and make a list of the ones you should have in your arsenal. And basically in a trial, you want everybody to have a unique artifact, and then you all call and use them at once and get massive burst damage. You want to have at least 10 scrolls of life. Don't expect others to pick you up when you die. Along with that, you want a full stone of health, especially when you're starting out newer in the trial. You shall experience that you take a lot of damage, and a stone of health with having the ability to instantly get you to full hit points, and you can use it every 18 seconds, is pretty massive for your survivability. And lastly, of course, you'll want to be using your buff consumables, overloads, event food, elixir, potions, and dragon potions, etc. That will all just help you within your combat effectiveness. Like a tank, we're using a bunch of stuff like Caprice, Fohammer's Favor Elixir, Potions of Deflect, and so on. As a healer, we're using like Wildstorm, Flask of Potency, Watermelon, pretty similar for DPS as well. Just make sure you're looking at what builds you have, and otherwise these requirements could seem a little bit excessive, but with any less you do not stand a chance of completing this thing unless you're a complete experienced group. And otherwise, of course, you could have less than these recommended requirements and still complete, due to the fact somebody else might have way above these requirements. Somebody might have like 1,000,000 encounter DPS on a Chilton dummy and be able to carry 2 or 3 DPS characters. But I wouldn't plan on that. Make sure you're meeting these recommended requirements before you attempt to go and jump into this trial. Of course, do not expect to join the trial by joining up in the public queue Crown of Keldegonn. You're never going to get in. Nobody is ever going to queue in the public queue unless it's the same person like you. You want to be jumping in a private queue. You want to invite a bunch of people, all 10 of them, rearrange the groups and so on. Again, I'm going to go over how to create groups for trials in a separate video. Here, I just wanted to go over my recommendation for this specific trial and what requirements. I'll have the document linked in the video description below. And overall, hopefully I presented this well. If I did, consider leaving the video a like. If you're new around here, consider subscribing. We'll see you guys around. Goodbye for now.